Great. So we'll do this next topic, and then we'll take a short break so people can get up and stretch their legs and get some more treats from the back. But we're going to talk right now about trade-offs between using seeds, plugs, and sod mats. And Loren Taylor is going to introduce this topic.
I'm not as tall as everyone else, so I'm going to just lower this a little bit. Can you guys hear me okay? Sweet. Okay, so we just covered the importance of species selection for how to achieve and consider some of your management and restoration goals. And now we're going to talk about the trade-offs for the different ways that the different techniques that you can use to restore these different species. And part of my research is taking a look at how these different decisions are being made, and like understanding what enables and constrains these decisions can inform our future research and also inform restoration. So I'm going to quickly go through some of the trade-offs that have come up as a reoccurring factor of importance in my manager interviews. And while I go through this list, I kind of want all of you to consider your own landscape, your own goals, and then also consider the constraints that are the most important or most critical for you, and how these techniques can achieve both your goals while also accommodating those constraints. Because as managers in practical situations, that's often what is required of us. So the list that I have here and what you're going to see on my following slides include these common trade-offs that most managers have been reporting. So that's source material availability, which we just talked about in our previous section here, cost of material, but also cost of implementation, right? Like there's a lot of costs that go into restoring these wetlands, so it's not just the cost of the material alone. We also have specialized equipment requirements for some of these different techniques. So considering if that's something that you need to invest in, or if that's something that you already have available to you. Labor requirements, right? Like we are all spread way too thin in this world. It's just a casualty that we have to contend with. But that's important because some of these techniques are way more labor intensive than others. Also, the planting timeline and the limitations that are associated with that has come up in the interviews quite frequently as something that people are wanting to understand more. As we've already covered, water management in wetlands is a huge component. And then, of course, we have our ecological factors like plant mortality and scalability. So we'll move on here. Oops. There we go. All right. Oh, we've got a little bit of a formatting issue here, but hopefully it's okay. So the first technique that we're going to cover here is seeding, because that's a very common practice that we have. And for the context of this, we're talking about sowing seeds, often with dormancy break or pre-treatment that have been applied, and we're applying that directly to the field, usually after some type of management action of Phragmites has occurred. So you can look at this table here with all those different trade-offs that we covered earlier, and you can see that the source material availability for seeds largely depends on the species that you're selecting. It's lower cost, but sometimes, again, that depends on the species in which you're selecting for. Some of these, less workhorse species might be a little bit more expensive to come by. It does require the equipment, specialized equipment, is a high cost, or it is a higher requirement. Usually you have to have a marsh master and some type of seed sowing apparatus for you to apply these on the landscape. So do you have access to one of those? The labor requirements, because it is mostly relying upon machinery, is quite low. So if you have machinery but you don't have personnel, this could be a good technique for you. The planting timeline does have some limitations, again, kind of going towards that water availability and management, which is being informed by some of our research, but that's something that we still need to understand a little bit more. The water management requirements here are pretty high. We also have high mortality for seeding. Of course, like we're applying seeds, they're way more vulnerable than using plugs or sod mats, which are more established and can withstand some of these drought conditions or water fluctuations a little bit more. But the scalability is quite high, right? Like, so if we are on a landscape that has huge acreage, this is going to probably be a very appealing approach for you. All right, next we have plug trade-offs. So when we're talking about plugs, we're talking about growing seedlings from seed in a control setting that we then use to establish they have established a well-developed root system, and then they are transplanted on the landscape, again, usually after some type of management activity has occurred. So with plugs, we do have a little bit we have like a medium range with source availability. There's still quite a few of those plant materials that you can find on the market, but again, that's species dependent. The cost for this, we categorized it as lower. It's not quite as low as seed, but again, it is lower than what we're going to talk about next, which is sod mats. But again, that's largely dependent on the species in which you are selecting for. The equipment requirements for this are low because usually you're transplanting these plugs by hand, but that means that labor requirements are high because you are transplanting these by hand. And the timing or the planting timeline for these are again in that medium category. This is mostly because we need to understand with research and inform this category a little bit more on the timeline in which these can be restored. The water management here is again high because you can't just plant plugs out there and not water them. They are still pretty vulnerable at this stage, and because of that, mortality is pretty dependent on water availability and then also the species that's been used. The scalability for this is significantly lower, again because it's manually being installed one by one on the landscape. All right, next we have sod mats. So this is typically a coconut fiber mat that has been planted with rhizomes or plugs. Those mats are then grown in a controlled setting for 1 to 2 seasons. They develop a very robust root system, and then they are transplanted to the site location. So you can see a picture of that if anyone is unfamiliar of these sod mats and what we're talking about. So the source material for sod mats is the lowest of all of these just because they require multiple years of pre-planting, growing in a greenhouse controlled setting, coordination with our vendors, and so there's also less species availability selection for them, so it's quite a bit lower. The costs are significantly higher, again because you're growing them for 1 to 2 seasons. It's a lot more time investment for the suppliers here. The equipment requirements we put in this category as medium and kind of depends because in one sense you just have to have enough people to roll the mat out on your landscape, but in some circumstances you need to transport these further into the wetland, which would require again like a marsh master or something like that could get you to the site that you're wanting to be restored. That's pretty variable depending on your context. The labor requirements for this are higher because these mats are heavy. I think they're around 100 pounds. Is that right? Yeah. Roughly 100 pounds. So it's at least a 2-person job. And so, yeah, depending on what your stamina is, how many of these 100-pound mats you're wanting to install with your 2-person team, you might need a lot more labor. So the planting timeline for this, with its limitations, is again medium. And we're going to talk about our experience with these in our experimental plots a little bit later in this presentation. Water management requirements here are also medium because these plants are much more established. They seem to be able to withstand fluctuation in water a little bit better than some of these other techniques do. And the good thing about sod mats is that the mortality is quite low. They can withstand a lot and they are quite successful once you've established them on the landscape. However, because they are so expensive, they do require a lot of labor. The scalability for these is pretty low, given typical budgets and funding. So for my final slide here, I just kind of wanted to show everyone what they look like together. So again, with that probing question that I presented to you earlier, when you look at this figure here or this table, consider what you have available to you, but also consider what your goals are, but consider what your most limiting constraint is, and that can kind of guide you in selecting which technique might produce that result for you. There's not going to be a one-size-fit-all approach with restoring these native plants in any scenario. So you kind of have to base it off of what you have available and what your most constraining factors are. So with that is all that I have.
Great, so we're going to hear from a handful of people now about their experiences either installing or producing these. And we've got both Rich Hansen and David England from Utah Division of Wildlife Resources. They're going to talk briefly about their experiences with seeds, plugs, and sod mats on these WMAs, and what you've installed, what has worked well, and what has been challenging. And I think they're both going to come up at the same time. But David wants Rich to go first. This is news to Rich. Okay, thanks guys. If you can just try to lean into the mic.
Okay. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. I've been managing wetlands for the Division of Wildlife for over 23 years now, so I've had some successes, but I've had a lot of failures, and I've learned a lot along the way. So we're tasked with managing the habitat, protecting infrastructure, but also providing good habitat for wildlife. And as probably most of you know, our wetlands are very, very managed. I mean, we've manipulated everything. We manipulate the water, and I've been involved in, I think, the construction of 5 new impoundments, and it seems like every project I'm involved with, we just barely get by with the budget. So if I had, any good recommendations, it would be allowing enough budget to put sod mats on your dikes, because the full encamp unit, I think we put about 100 sod mats out there. It's incredible. They were expensive. One nice thing we have is we get a lot of volunteers, so that's not an issue for us. It's always the budget that constrains what we do. And basically, I set Dave up for more work in the future by not having enough money to line the entire dike with these sod mats. Because, the 100 sod mats did a great job with the erosion control. They're well established. And I think 2 different times you and Jason have had to rebuild the dike where we didn't have the sod mats, right? I mean, just the erosion control is incredible, provides great nesting habitat for some of our diver species. And I can't say enough about them if you've got the budget. Plugs, I always like going with the biggest, the gallons if you can, but we've had success with the smaller plugs. Seeding, if we stratify it right, or are patient enough, that seems to work. We've tried to line some dikes at Ogden Bay, and we'll do it in the spring and nothing, and then the next year it seems to just blow up. So it does work, but along those lines, if we're patient, Phragmites tends to reinvade faster than what we're planting in some situations. So. I'll let you talk a little bit.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. Just back to Rich's point, I mean, most of these areas that we're focusing on are on the dike lines. These are highly disturbed areas, so we're needing rapid establishment in these areas. And unfortunately, seeding just cannot get established quick enough. We have a lot of wave action. Most of our ponds are these big open water bodies, so when we have a storm or any front move in, we have a lot of wave action, and that will just kind of take the seed away from where we're wanting to establish. And I just want to point out on the Fohlenkamp, back to the sod mats. You drive across Fohlenkamp right now, you'll see a big patch of hard stem, and that's where the mat was. And then right adjacent to that, you have maybe 3 to 5 feet where the dike has eroded back. So just this, the sod mats are great, and like Rich said, if we could just have the funding to just line all of these dike lines with sod mats, it would be great. I do want to point out though, with plugs, we did a big project a couple years ago on Teal Lake, and we do have a lot of volunteers that we can get to, but I think the hard thing about plugs is quality control, and also the substrate that you're planting the plugs into. So we planted 3,500 plugs on Teal Lake, and unfortunately, about a week later, we had another wind event, and we've lost 90% of our plugs. And I think part of that was due to not setting the plugs in properly, compressing them in there into the soil, or they were making too big of a cavity in there, so at the bottom there was just an air pocket in there, and that was just kind of over time with that wave action, that sediment kind of just dispersed out, and then that plug just floated out. So I think quality control is kind of a big issue with the plugs. And then with seeding, I mean, at the scale that we're treating Phragmites and we're trying to get that establishment, that's pretty much the most cost effective for us. However, that does it does have a lot of challenges. And for like the last 3 years, we've worked through a lot of those challenges, but we're still learning. Some of the biggest ones is timing. Our timeline for planting is usually from April to June, and that's when we have spring runoff. And so water levels are pretty dynamic out here, and we want to make sure that we're seeding in the area and the seed stays in that area and not just get washed out. So trying to find that right timeline where the soil conditions are right, moisture levels for germination, and there was some research out of Karin's lab with microtopography, and so now we've actually started disking, and it's created this moisture gradient now, and so we seed over that, and we've been seeing a lot of success with that. So, but as far as with equipment too, with seeding, we've had to make a lot of modifications. Wetland seed presents a lot of challenges, so going back to breaking dormancy, we cold stratified the seed, and so the seed is clumpy and wet and moist, and when we put it in our broadcaster, we get a lot of bridging going on. So right above the agitator, it will pack that seed and create a pocket, and so usually we have to have someone back there with a paddle breaking that up and making sure that we're spreading seed uniformly over that area. So yeah, we've had to make a lot of modifications to the seeder and the Marsh Master, but we just seeded 40 acres, so we're going to go take a look at, and we've had a lot of success. But yeah.
Okay, so our last speaker on this topic, we've got Jeff Klausmann again, and he's going to talk about his experiences with production and installation of sod mats and plugs. So, thanks.
So, again, our experiences with a lot of species north of here, and the main crux with using seed is getting germination, reliable germination in the field. So from the install end, which we've had quite a lot of experience with, we like to use plugs and mats. Once you get a vegetated plant out there, if you can keep it in place, we generally see good results. We see better, we see a lot more resilience to uncertainties with hydrology, where we would lose seed. And don't get me wrong, we do a lot of seeding. It's just where most of the plants that we seed are grasses. They're not sedges or some of the more obligate plants. We have difficulty with some of those plants, even getting germination in our greenhouse. So you can imagine how challenging that is in the field. And we're working, we can get the hydrology just right. We can work with the right amplitude and temperatures and pre-treatments, and we still don't get reliable germination across all species and then across seed sources. Even from year to year, we've done a lot of work with the Park Service, and we'll go out and collect seed from a given stand, do all the pre-treatments, get wonderful germination, and the following year we'll collect from similar stands, try all the same magic, and have poor results. So there's just a lot of uncertainty with some of the wettest species in trying to get reliable germination from seed. At a field scale, I would say that it's mostly, it's already been mentioned, but getting the hydrology just right is nearly impossible. It's not hard when we're working in moist or saturated soils. It's more difficult when we're working in soils that we need any kind of inundation, and you can't have too much, but you have to have a little. I mean, it's just tough to make that happen at field scale, has been our experience. We work with the standard sort of 10 cubic inch plant. We grow a lot of those custom for clients, like I said, across the West. We love to grow those. That plant material is very high quality. You know, it's starting from a seed, so you have a much more structured root system, and I think that can be an advantage. My putting on the install hat now, we've put in millions of these plants. I like quantity over quality when it comes to getting the plants out, so I would rather put more plants in a given area to sort of start the trajectory that we're after than use more expensive plants and spread them out further. There's just a lot of opportunity for the plants that you don't want to get established in there, and once they're in there, it's very difficult to manage those plants. So we've developed, for our own needs, we've developed a lot of bare root sources because I can get about 2 plants for the cost of one, custom grown 10 cubic inch plant. That's obviously not practical unless we're at very large scale to do for a custom grow. If we had a sustained order for a particular suite of species, it would be possible maybe to grow large quantities of bare root plants. But for the most part, when we're taking in seed from a diversity of places and people, we're growing from seed. I do encourage, though, people to take a chance with the bare root plants, because once your crews are trained in how to handle those plants, the survival, the expansion, the growth is nearly identical to a 10 cubic inch seedling, for example. So don't be afraid of the bare root plants.
So for those of you that don't know what these bare root plants look like when we go to the field, one of the first things we're going to do is actually do a demo of, we have a sod mat?
We do.
Okay, a sod mat and a plug and a bare root, just so you can see best practices, how to install them well, what you might, if you put a lot of these in, we will very quickly learn all the mistakes we've been making over the last few years. So I'm going to ask one question to Jeff that came from Keith, actually. What's the reasoning behind the sod mat size? Is it 1 by 5 meters or something like that? And is it possible to make smaller versions of that? Would it make sense to make them easier to transport?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think there's a lot of magic with sizing. I mean, all of the sod mats were originally modeled after a Rolanka product. I don't know if you guys have used just erosion control materials without plants. And that's what was available on the market at scale. And so everything was sort of built off that framing. And it's a 5 square meter mat. And it's essentially a pillowcase made out of coir rope. And then it's just stuffed with coir batting. And what we like to try to tell people, we use a lot of the product not just for on dikes and in wetlands, but the product is also used quite effectively on stream banks for initial erosion control. But we're not ever testing how well we can stick it to the ground, right? It's just a mechanism for getting the plants that will carry all of that weight on erosion protection, but we have to get them established. And so when we're using them, say, in a fluvial setting, we're not putting them in before a big high water event, because then it's not the plants doing any of the work. We're just testing how well we can stake it, anchor it, whatever. We want to get the plants established so that at the next high water event, they can hold the bank together. The same would be on a dike shoreline. It was never really conceived that these would be used just blanketed across the landscape. they're used in really high energy places because we have the advantage of getting a full year of growth in the plants before they get installed. We've broken germination. They expand rapidly, but they're obviously too expensive to use just wall to wall. You want to be selective. You can come in behind sod match, which is what we often do with plugs, and then transitioning into seed. That's a common approach. In theory, yes, getting back to the question, we could have smaller mats. We'd have to change some of our, our product we have manufactured in Sri Lanka. And so there's a lead time in getting the mats, and we've sort of worked on perfecting them over time, just dealing with the pitfalls that we saw when we were just using an off-the-shelf product like a Sri Lanka mat. So that would have to be changed up. There are people that cut the mats. They're a pain to cut. That's why they're so good at erosion control. But there are ways to cut the mats. Your install people will hate you if you make them cut all the mats. But it is possible. Yeah, we could certainly grow into a smaller mat. They can be unwieldy. We've tried every kind of equipment assist. There's nothing faster as far as cost goes than two strong people with hay hooks, just brute force moving them around. We just haven't made that faster. You start picking them up multiple times with a skid steer or a track skid steer, and it's more costly on the install end. So you just need a bunch of go-getters, 25 and younger, and you're well on your way.
Does anybody else want to ask anything? Yeah.
I'm just curious if there have been any tests of combinations of putting in some of the quarter mats in the field and seeding over, and then those quarter mats kind of create those sod mats in the field. Has anything like that been tested?
Yeah, so the question is, have there been tests of sod mats with seeding around it or sod mats with plugs? Have you done that in any of your installs? Do you want to comment on that briefly?
We have done that. We've had customers that like the idea of having the instantaneous erosion protection from the pillow, but they don't have time to actually get those impregnated with all the rhizomes and roots. And I would advise against that. That's expensive, and I just don't think you're getting the benefit of a plant that's fully mature within the mat. One advantage that we see a lot, we work a lot with wetland managers who are dealing with a lot of herbivory, and so we'll put mats down, and you'll have a flock of geese come in and just completely mow the entire mat down. If that were plugs, we also see they'll pull the plugs and just lay them next to the hole, which we try to blame our planters, but it's really the geese. But the mats will tend to, you're essentially buying the roots, and they'll tend to re-sprout again. The geese will move on and they'll regrow. So there is a real advantage of getting the product with the plants already integrated from what we've seen. And we've tried it all different ways.
Great, so we have one more topic, but I think we should take a quick break.